In 1940, archaeologists discovered textiles in a Nevada cave that should not exist. Diamond-plaited tule matting had splits so narrow and even they looked machine-made. Rabbit skin blankets showed stitching described as nearly invisible. Moccasins were constructed from 2 different animal furs, carefully selected and sewn together. One expert examining a woven bag said you could accuse them of having bought it at a market in Arizona last year. But these textiles were not made last year. They were not made 2,000 years ago, which is what the discoverers thought. When scientists finally tested them in 1996, the results were staggering. 10,600 years old, older than the Egyptian pyramids by 5,000 years, the oldest intact textiles ever found in North America. And they looked modern, the level of sophistication, the quality of craftsmanship, the engineering precision, all of it defied expectations about what ancient people could do. But here is the deeper mystery. Textiles almost never survive. Organic materials decay within years, sometimes months, leaving almost no trace in the archaeological record. For every stone tool in a museum, there were probably dozens of woven baskets, leather bags, wooden implements that vanished completely. So why did these textiles survive for 10,600 years when everything else from that time period is gone? Sidney and Georgia Wheeler found them in Spirit Cave, 13 miles east of Fallon, Nevada, in the summer of 1940. The Wheelers were conducting salvage archaeology, racing against commercial guano miners who were destroying caves across the region. 2 feet down through compacted bat droppings, Georgia's trowel hit woven matting. Underneath was a body, partially mummified, wrapped in rabbit fur and tule reeds. The textiles were in remarkable condition. The Wheelers estimated the burial was maybe 2,000 years old based on the weaving style. They photographed everything, transported the remains to the Nevada State Museum, and filed a brief report. Then the artifacts sat in sealed boxes for 50 years. Both Wheelers died, never knowing they had discovered something that would rewrite our understanding of ancient North America. In 1994, anthropologist R. Irv Taylor at the University of California, Riverside had access to a new technology. Accelerator mass spectrometry, called AMS dating, represented a revolution in radiocarbon analysis. Unlike conventional radiocarbon dating, which required gram-sized samples and destroyed significant portions of artifacts, AMS could date milligram samples, a single fiber, a fragment of bone, a piece of charcoal the size of a grain of rice. This meant Taylor could test the Spirit Cave materials without destroying them. He selected 17 samples: hair from the mummy's scalp, cortical bone from the femur, individual fibers from the tule matting, threads from the rabbit skin blanket, and charcoal fragments from what appeared to be a hearth layer beneath the burial. He sent splits of each sample to his lab at UC Riverside for initial testing. The results came back ranging from 9,400 to 9,500 radiocarbon years before present. Taylor assumed there had been a calibration error. Nothing in the Great Basin was supposed to be that old. He sent duplicate samples to the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit in England, one of the most prestigious dating facilities in the world. Oxford confirmed the UC Riverside dates. Still skeptical, Taylor sent additional samples to Beta Analytic in Florida and the University of Arizona AMS facility. Every laboratory returned dates in the same range, 9,400 to 9,500 radiocarbon years before present. When calibrated against the radiocarbon curve to account for atmospheric fluctuations in carbon-14 over time, those radiocarbon dates translated to approximately 10,000 calendar years before present plus 600 years. The error margins were tight, plus or minus 200 years in most cases. There was no question about the validity. Multiple labs, multiple samples, consistent results. The Spirit Cave textiles were not 2,000 years old. They were more than 10,000 years old. The textiles wrapping this man were 10,600 years old. The woven bags beside him, the rabbit skin blankets, the carefully crafted moccasins, all of it dated to the end of the last ice age. These were not crude survival tools. They were sophisticated textiles with weaving techniques that stunned modern experts. Diamond-plaited tule matting with splits so narrow and even the work looked machine-made. Rabbit skin blankets with stitching described as nearly invisible. Moccasins constructed from 2 different types of fur, carefully selected and sewn. One archaeologist looking at a woven bag said you could accuse them of having bought it at a market in Arizona last year. This level of craftsmanship should not exist 10,600 years ago. And yet here it was, preserved in a Nevada cave, waiting to answer a question no one had thought to ask. Why did these textiles survive when almost nothing else from that time period did? Before we go further, what country are you watching from right now? Leave a comment with your answer. I love seeing how far lost evidence reaches across the globe. And if you are fascinated by how ancient preservation science reveals what usually vanishes from history, hit like. It helps bring these stories to more people who want to know the truth about the ancient Americas. To understand why spirit cave textiles survived, you need to understand why organic materials almost never do. Every textile, every piece of wood, every plant fiber, every fragment of leather is made of organic molecules, cellulose and plant fibers, protein and animal materials. These molecules are food for microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, molds. They consume organic matter and break it down into simpler compounds. This is decomposition. It happens everywhere, constantly, and it erases almost all evidence of ancient organic technology from the archaeological record. Decomposition requires three things: warmth, moisture, and oxygen. Microorganisms need heat to function. They need water to metabolize. They need oxygen to respire. If you have all three conditions present, organic materials decay rapidly. A cotton shirt buried in moist soil will be gone in months. Leather in a wet environment breaks down within years. Wood exposed to the elements rots. This is why archaeologists find so much stone and so little textile. Stone does not decompose. It weathers slowly over thousands of years, but the material persists. Organic materials vanish. They leave almost no trace unless something stops the decay process. The archaeological literature is clear on this. Organic remains, including skeletal material, animal parts, plant matter, and textiles all suffer from decomposition. Their survival depends entirely on the surrounding environment. Most prehistoric sites yield zero organic artifacts. Everything that was once woven, sewn, or made from plants has disappeared. The few exceptions happen only under extreme conditions. These are places where one of the three requirements for decay is missing. Frozen environments work because cold stops microorganisms. The Iceman found in the Alps and the mummies recovered from glaciers survive because bacteria cannot function at temperatures below freezing. Waterlogged environments work because submersion in water excludes oxygen. Peat bogs preserve bodies for thousands of years because the water is so saturated with organic acids that oxygen cannot penetrate. Arid environments work because desiccation removes moisture. No water means no microorganism activity. This is what happened at Spirit Cave. But dryness alone does not explain Spirit Cave's exceptional preservation. The cave had another advantage: guano. For thousands of years, bats roosted in the cave and their droppings accumulated in thick layers across the floor, sometimes 3 to 6 feet deep. Guano creates a unique microenvironment. It is organic material, rich in nitrogen and phosphorus, and it also seals the surface below it. Those layers effectively capped the burial, reducing air circulation and creating a stable, desiccated zone beneath. The combination of arid climate and guano sealing produced what archaeologists call a hyper-arid, low humidity microenvironment with minimal moisture, stable temperature, and limited oxygen flow. These are the conditions that preserve organic materials for millennia. The tule matting is woven in a diamond-plaited pattern. This is not simple over-under weaving. Diamond plating requires predetermined planning. They had to split the tule reeds into strips of uniform width. Modern weaving experts examining these textiles noted that the splits were so narrow and so even, they looked professionally processed. The cord threads were well spun. The weaving itself was tight, close, and consistent across the entire surface. This is evidence of motor control, of practiced skill, and of a weaving tradition that had been refined over generations. The rabbit skin blankets show even more sophistication. Rabbit fur is delicate, and it tears easily. To make a blanket, you have to skin the rabbits, process the hides, cut them into strips, and then weave or sew the strips together. The Spirit Cave blankets were made by cutting rabbit pelts into long, continuous strips and then twisting those strips to create cordage. The cordage was then woven into a textile. The stitching holding it together was described as nearly invisible. The person who made this blanket had mastered the fine motor control needed to work with thread thin enough to almost disappear. The moccasins are equally impressive. They were constructed from 2 different types of animal fur, one type for the upper and another for the sole. This is material selection based on function. The sole needs to be tougher, more abrasion resistant, and the upper can be softer and more flexible. Whoever made these moccasins understood the mechanical properties of different furs and chose them deliberately. The construction technique involved careful sewing to join the pieces together. No metal needles existed 10,600 years ago. Instead, they used bone awls to punch holes and then threaded sinew or plant fiber by hand. The result was footwear functional enough to protect feet in rugged terrain. These are not the textiles of people barely surviving at the edge of technological capability. These are the textiles of a culture with deep knowledge of materials, sophisticated manufacturing techniques, and aesthetic standards. The people who made these items knew what quality looked like and how to achieve it. And then everything vanished from the archaeological record for thousands of years, not because the knowledge disappeared, but because the conditions that preserve organic materials are so rare that we almost never find them. Look at the timeline. Spirit Cave textiles date to 10,600 years before present. The next major textile assemblage in the Great Basin comes from Lovelock Cave, located about 120 miles northwest of Spirit Cave. Lovelock Cave was excavated in 1912, and again in the 1920s and in the 1960s. Archaeologists recovered over 10,000 artifacts: baskets, nets, duck decoys, sandals, mats, all made from tule, willow, sagebrush bark. The preservation was exceptional, similar to Spirit Cave: dry cave, bat guano, stable conditions. But the dates were different. The Lovelock Cave textiles range from about 4,000 years ago to 600 years before present. That is a gap of more than 6,000 years between Spirit Cave and the earliest Lovelock materials. Does that gap mean weaving disappeared for 6,000 years? No. It means the conditions that preserve textiles are so specific that most sites do not have them. Between Spirit Cave and Lovelock Cave, people were living throughout the Great Basin. They were making baskets, weaving mats, creating cordage, sewing clothing. We know this because the technology appears fully formed at Lovelock Cave 4,000 years ago. You do not develop sophisticated twined basketry, complex netting techniques, and decorative weaving patterns from scratch. These are traditions that build over time, passed from generation to generation, refined through practice. The Lovelock Cave artifacts demonstrate this continuity in remarkable ways. Among the most famous finds are the duck decoys. These are not simple stick and feather constructions. They're engineered hunting tools. The bodies were woven from tule in a tightly controlled pattern that creates a hollow, buoyant form. Real duck feathers were then attached to the exterior using cordage made from twisted plant fibers. The decoys were weighted at the bottom to float upright. Some still had anchor lines attached, cords that would have tethered them in place on the water's surface. When archaeologists tested these decoys in water, they floated naturally, their silhouettes indistinguishable from real ducks at a distance. This is not accidental design. This is hydrodynamic engineering based on detailed observation of how ducks behave on water. The Lovelock Cave textiles show the same level of skill as Spirit Cave. They use similar materials: tule, willow, sagebrush bark. They employ similar techniques: twining, pleating, cordage production. The knowledge clearly persisted across the gap. We just cannot see it in the archaeological record because organic materials decayed everywhere except in a handful of dry caves. This is preservation bias. The archaeological record is not a complete picture of the past. It is a heavily filtered sample, skewed toward materials that survive. Stone tools are everywhere because stone lasts. Textiles are rare because organic matter decays. If you only looked at stone tools, you would think ancient people had no sophisticated technology beyond chipping rocks. Spirit Cave and Lovelock Cave prove that is false. These cultures had complex textile industries. They had weaving traditions that required years of training to master. They had aesthetic preferences, a functional understanding of materials, and manufacturing techniques that rival pre-industrial societies anywhere in the world. The gap in the archaeological record is a gap in preservation, not a gap in culture. And now we have proof. In 2025, a study published in American Antiquity by David Hurst Thomas and colleagues at the American Museum of Natural History provided the genetic evidence that closes the loop. The research team analyzed DNA from the Spirit Cave mummy and compared it to ancient and modern populations across the Americas. They also compiled radiocarbon dates from 482 archaeological sites across the Lahontan Basin, the region including Spirit Cave and Lovelock Cave. They were testing a specific hypothesis. Did the same population occupy this region continuously for 10,000 years, despite climate changes, droughts, and resource fluctuations? The DNA results were unambiguous. The Spirit Cave individual is genetically related to modern Native Americans. More specifically, he shares direct ancestry with the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe, the indigenous group living near Spirit Cave today. The genetic lineage traces from the Paleo-Indian populations at Spirit Cave through the Lovelock culture communities that used the caves between 4,000 and 600 years ago to the northern Paiute people documented in the historic period. There was no population replacement. The same people, or rather their descendants, lived in this region for 10,000 years. Their radiocarbon analysis confirmed the continuity. The study used summed probability distributions to map occupation intensity across time. If populations disappeared and were replaced by different groups, you would see gaps in the radiocarbon dates or abrupt changes in the distribution. Instead, the data showed continuous occupation. There were fluctuations. During the late Holocene dry period, a megadrought lasting more than 1,000 years, from 1150 BC to 150 AD, the radiocarbon dates show population movement. People left the lower elevation lake basins and moved to highland refugia where water sources persisted, but they came back. When the drought ended around 750 AD, Lovelock communities returned to the same caves their ancestors had used centuries earlier. They refurbished the same villages. They buried their dead in the same mortuary caves. And critically, they maintained the same material culture. The Lovelock weavers still crafted catlow twine textiles, a twined weaving technique that dates back 9,000 years. They still made baskets from tule. They still use the same core reduction strategies for stone tools. This is cultural continuity despite environmental stress. The Spirit Cave case also underscores something anthropologists have known but rarely get to demonstrate archaeologically. Oral tradition works. The Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe has always maintained that their people have lived in this region since time immemorial. For decades, archaeologists dismissed these claims. They argued that the Spirit Cave remains predated contemporary tribes by thousands of years and could not reasonably be affiliated with modern populations. The legal battle that followed the 1996 dating results lasted 20 years. In 1997, the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe filed a claim under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, asserting cultural affiliation with the Spirit Cave remains and requesting repatriation. The Bureau of Land Management, which controlled the remains as they were found on federal land, refused. In their 2000 formal determination, the Bureau of Land Management stated there was no evidence the northern Paiute had occupied the Spirit Cave area for any significant time before European contact in the early 1800s. The implication was clear. 10,600 years was too old. No modern tribe could reasonably claim descent from people that ancient. The tribe sued. The case deadlocked in federal court for years. At issue was a fundamental question. How do you prove cultural continuity across 10,000 years when almost no physical evidence survives? Stone tools change style. Pottery, if it exists at all in the Great Basin, is rare and varies over time. Burial practices shift. Settlement patterns move in response to climate. What remains constant? The tribe argued that their oral histories, passed down across generations, constituted evidence. The Bureau of Land Management countered that oral tradition could not be verified scientifically, and therefore could not establish affiliation under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. The stalemate broke in 2015 when both parties agreed to allow DNA testing. Evolutionary geneticist Eske Willerslev from the University of Copenhagen, who had pioneered ancient DNA extraction techniques, was given permission to sample the Spirit Cave remains. Willerslev extracted DNA from the petrous portion of the temporal bone, a dense structure inside the skull that preserves genetic material better than any other part of the skeleton. The results, published in Science in 2018, were definitive and unambiguous. The DNA and radiocarbon evidence proved the tribe was correct, and the archaeologists were wrong. The Paiute oral history preserves knowledge of a 10,000-year presence that archaeology, limited by preservation bias, could not see. This has implications beyond Spirit Cave. How many other indigenous oral traditions are dismissed as myth because the material evidence has not survived? How much cultural knowledge is encoded in stories that cannot be verified through stone tools and pottery? The Spirit Cave DNA study suggests that when indigenous communities say they have always been here, we should take that claim seriously. The genetic and radiocarbon data now confirm what the Fallon Paiute Shoshone have said all along. Their ancestors were the people who wove those diamond-plaited mats, who sewed those rabbit-skin blankets, who walked in those moccasins 10,600 years ago. Let's return to the original question. Why did spirit cave textiles survive for 10,000 years when almost all other organic materials from that period decayed? The answer is a combination of environmental conditions and archaeological luck. Spirit cave had the right geology, a small rocky alcove that stayed dry. It had the right climate, arid desert with minimal precipitation. It had the right microenvironment, bat guano sealing the deposits and creating hyper-arid conditions. And it had the right timing. The burial happened during a period when the cave was actively accumulating guano, so the textiles were sealed quickly. If any one of those factors had been different, the textiles would have decayed. If the cave had been slightly lower in elevation, seasonal flooding might have introduced moisture. If the cave faced a different direction, temperature fluctuations might have allowed condensation. If bats had not roosted there, the surface would have remained exposed to air circulation. Any of those changes would have allowed microorganisms to colonize the textiles and break them down. This is why textile preservation is so rare. You need multiple conditions to align perfectly, and those conditions have to remain stable for thousands of years. Spirit Cave had that alignment. So did Lovelock Cave. So did a handful of other dry caves in the Great Basin and the Colorado Plateau. But most sites do not. Consider the rarity across North America. In the Pacific Northwest, the Ozette site on the Olympic Peninsula preserved wooden artifacts, baskets, and woven mats because a mudslide buried a village 500 years ago, sealing everything in an oxygen-free environment. In the Southwest, basketmaker caves in the Four Corners region contained textiles dating back 2,000 years, preserved by extreme aridity, similar to Spirit Cave. In Florida, peat bogs at Windover preserved woven fabric from 8,000 years ago because waterlogged, acidic conditions prevented decay. Each of these sites is exceptional. Each required a specific, rare set of environmental conditions. Combined, they represent perhaps a dozen locations across an entire continent where organic materials survived from prehistoric times. Compare that to stone tool sites. There are thousands of Paleo-Indian sites across North America. Clovis points have been found in every state. Folsom, Goshen, Scottsbluff, and Dalton points are common in the archaeological record. But textiles, a handful of sites. Most burials happen in open ground where moisture, temperature, and oxygen levels fluctuate. Textiles buried in those contexts decay within decades or centuries. The archaeological record shows us only the tiny fraction of ancient material culture that happened to end up in preservation-friendly environments. Everything else is lost. But here is what we can now say with confidence. The gap in textile evidence is not a gap in textile production. The people living in the Great Basin between 10,600 years ago and 4,000 years ago were making textiles. They had to. You cannot survive in a desert environment without containers for water, without cordage for snares and nets, without woven mats for shelter, without sewn clothing for protection against temperature extremes. The technology existed, it was being used, it was being taught to the next generation. We just cannot see most of it in the archaeological record because organic materials decay. Spirit Cave and Lovelock Cave are windows into a continuous tradition that persisted for 10,000 years. The ancient DNA confirms it. The radiocarbon dates confirm it. The similarity of techniques across time confirms it. This also tells us something important about technological transmission. Weaving is not instinctive. You do not figure out diamond plating or twined basketry by trial and error in a single generation. These are learned skills that require instruction, practice, and cultural continuity. Someone has to teach you how to split tule reeds evenly. Someone has to show you the over-under pattern for diamond plating. Someone has to demonstrate the twist technique for rabbit fur cordage. And that teaching happens within a community that values the skill enough to invest time in training the next generation. The presence of sophisticated weaving at Spirit Cave 10,600 years ago means there was already a weaving tradition in place. This was not the beginning. This was a mature technology that had been developing for who knows how long before the Spirit Cave burial. The same applies to Lovelock Cave 4,000 years ago. The textiles are not experimental. They are refined, consistent, demonstrating techniques that have been standardized across the community. This is what cultural continuity looks like, a knowledge system that persists across generations, transmitted orally and through hands-on practice, maintained even when environmental conditions forced populations to move. The Lovelock communities that returned to the Carson and Humboldt sinks after the late Holocene dry period brought their weaving knowledge with them. They did not have to reinvent basketry. They already knew how to do it because their ancestors had been doing it for thousands of years, and that knowledge continued right up to the historic period. When European explorers and ethnographers encountered the northern Paiute in the 1800s, they documented a thriving textile tradition: tule mats for shelter, twined baskets for gathering and storage, cordage for nets and snares, rabbit fur blankets for warmth. The same materials, the same techniques, the same functional understanding that we see at Spirit Cave and Lovelock Cave. Ethnographer Julian Stewart, working among Great Basin tribes in the 1920s and 30s, recorded detailed observations of northern Paiute weaving practices. He noted that women gathered tule in late summer when the reeds reached maximum height, but before they became brittle. The reeds were split while still green, using a thumbnail or a sharp stone to create the initial division, then carefully pulled apart to create strips of uniform width. The strips were kept damp during the weaving process, then allowed to dry once the mat was complete. The shrinkage as the tule dried created an extraordinarily tight weave that was nearly waterproof. Stewart also documented the construction of rabbit fur blankets, a process he described as labor-intensive but essential for winter survival. Rabbits were snared using nets made from twisted hemp cordage. The pelts were skinned in a continuous spiral, creating a single long strip from each rabbit. Multiple strips were then twisted together to create a thick cord. These cords were woven using a simple frame loom, creating a blanket that was warm, lightweight, and durable. Stewart noted that skilled weavers could produce a blanket in 3 to 4 days if rabbits were abundant. These ethnographic descriptions match the Spirit Cave artifacts almost exactly. The diamond-plaited tule mats found in the burial used the same materials and the same splitting technique Stewart documented. The rabbit fur blanket construction is identical. The stitching methods are the same. 10,000 years separate the Spirit Cave weaver from the northern Paiute weavers, Stewart observed, and yet the technology is continuous. The tradition never stopped. It adapted, it changed in response to new materials and new needs, but the core knowledge persisted across 10,600 years without writing, without external record keeping, transmitted entirely through oral instruction and hands-on training within families and communities. This is what makes Spirit Cave textiles so significant. They are not just old, they are proof of something much larger. Proof that cultural knowledge can persist for timescales that dwarf written history. Proof that oral tradition is a reliable mechanism for transmitting complex technical information across hundreds of generations. Proof that the people who wove those mats 10,600 years ago were part of a continuous lineage that extends to the present day. The textiles survived because of exceptional preservation conditions. The knowledge survived because of cultural institutions that valued teaching, practice, and continuity. The Spirit Cave textiles force us to reconsider how we think about ancient North America. For too long, archaeology focused on stone tools because that is what survives. Projectile points, scrapers, blades. Now, these are important. They tell us about hunting strategies and raw material procurement and technological change. But they are only one part of the story. Textiles, cordage, baskets, these were equally important to daily life, probably more important in terms of time invested. A skilled weaver might spend weeks making a single basket. A hunter might make a spear point in an hour. The textile technology represents a huge investment of labor and knowledge. It is the invisible majority of ancient material culture, invisible because it decayed, but no less real for its absence in most archaeological sites. Spirit Cave gives us a rare glimpse of that invisible majority, and what we see is sophistication, technical skill, aesthetic refinement, cultural knowledge passed down across generations. This is not a snapshot of people struggling to survive at the edge of capability. This is a snapshot of people who had mastered their environment, who had developed technologies suited to the specific challenges of the Great Basin, and who maintained those technologies for thousands of years. The textiles survived because the preservation conditions were perfect. The knowledge survived because the cultural transmission mechanisms were robust. Both are extraordinary. Both are worth understanding, and both tell us that 10,600 years ago, the people living in what is now Nevada were every bit as intelligent, as creative, as technically skilled as people anywhere else at any other time. They simply lived in a world where most evidence of their capabilities has not survived. The Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe calls the spirit cave individual the storyteller. That name is fitting. His survival, wrapped in textiles that should have decayed millennia ago, tells a story that archaeology alone could not. A story of cultural continuity across 10,000 years. A story of knowledge systems that persist despite environmental catastrophe, population movement, and the passage of time. A story of oral tradition as a reliable mechanism for historical memory, and a story of weaving, one of humanity's oldest and most important technologies, practiced with skill and care by people who understood their materials, their environment, and their place in a lineage that stretches back to the end of the Ice Age and forward to the present day. The textiles survived because Spirit Cave had the right conditions. The knowledge survived because the people who created it valued teaching the next generation. Both forms of survival are rare. Both are profound. And both remind us that the past is deeper, more complex, and more continuous than the stone, tools, and pottery sherds in most archaeological sites can reveal. If you enjoyed discovering how 10,000-year-old weaving reveals what usually vanishes from history, check out the video on screen for more lost evidence.